In a quaint little town nestled among rolling hills and whispering trees, the sun flooded through the large bay window of Margaret's cozy living room, casting a warm glow over the mismatched furniture that had accumulated over the years. The scent of freshly baked cookies lingered in the air, mingling with the faint aroma of the lavender that Margaret loved to keep in a small vase on the table. On the worn rug, Emily, a bright-eyed 10-year-old with an untamed mane of chestnut curls, sat cross-legged, her gaze fixed intently on the chessboard before her. "All right, Emily, it's your turn," Margaret said, her voice a soothing melody, rich with encouragement. She leaned back in her chair, her silver hair catching the light as she smiled warmly at her granddaughter. Emily furrowed her brow in concentration, her small fingers poised above her knight. "But Grandma, if I move here, won't you just take my piece with your queen?" Margaret chuckled softly, her eyes twinkling with amusement. "Ah, my dear, that's exactly the point. You must always think a few moves ahead. It's not just about the pieces on the board. It's about understanding your opponent's strategy. What do you think I'm planning?" Emily looked up, her blue eyes sparkling with the thrill of the game. "You're trying to trick me," she exclaimed, her laughter ringing through the room like music. "Okay, I'll move my knight here." She made her move boldly, a proud grin spreading across her face. Margaret leaned over the board, adjusting her glasses as she examined the new position. "A bold move," she declared, nodding in approval. "But tell me, what will you do next if I take your knight?" As the game continued, the two shared stories and laughter, a cocoon of warmth wrapping around them. Emily loved these moments with her grandmother, where time seemed to stand still and her worries melted away. Margaret's nurturing nature was like a balm to her soul, a comforting presence amidst the chaos of the world outside. However, just as Emily was about to make another move, the tranquility of the moment shattered with the sudden sound of the doorbell ringing. Margaret's smile faltered slightly as she exchanged a glance with Emily. "I wonder who that could be," she said, a hint of concern creasing her brow. "Do you think it's Mrs. Henderson with more of those awful vegetables?" Emily teased, her playful spirit returning as she hopped to her feet. Margaret shook her head, a chuckle escaping her lips. "Let's hope not. I'll get it. Why don't you tidy up the chess pieces?" As Margaret opened the door, the atmosphere in the room shifted dramatically. Standing on the porch was Sarah, Emily's estranged mother, her expression a mix of determination and desperation. The shadows of their complicated past loomed large as she stepped inside, the warmth of the sun seeming to dim in her presence. "Emily," Sarah called, her voice laced with a mixture of excitement and urgency. "I've come to take you home." Emily froze, her heart racing. She exchanged a worried glance with her grandmother, who stood with her arms crossed, a protective stance that spoke volumes. "Sarah, what are you doing here?" Margaret asked, her voice steady but edged with tension. "This isn't the time for—" "I know what you think, Margaret," Sarah interrupted, her tone sharp. "But this is about Emily and me. We need to rebuild our relationship. She deserves to be with her mother." Emily felt torn, her thoughts racing. She wanted to leap into her mother's arms, to feel the connection she so desperately craved. Yet the warmth and safety of her grandmother's presence anchored her to the spot. "Mom, Emily began, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know if I want to go." "See?" Sarah turned to Margaret, a triumphant glint in her eyes. "She's unsure. She needs me." Margaret stepped forward, her expression fierce. "Emily is safe here, Sarah. She's happy. You have to understand that wanting to be a mother doesn't mean you can just take her away whenever you feel like it." "That's not fair," Sarah shot back, her frustration boiling over. "I'm her mother. I deserve a chance to prove myself." Emily watched as the tension escalated, the air thick with emotions. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest, a mix of confusion and fear swirling within her. "Mom, please don't fight," she said softly, her voice trembling. "I just want us to be okay." The two women turned their gazes toward her. The fight momentarily paused as they absorbed the weight of Emily's words. Margaret knelt down to Emily's level, her eyes filled with concern. "Sweetheart, I know this is difficult, but you have a home here, a place filled with love and stability. You don't have to choose right now." Sarah's expression shifted, a flicker of hurt crossing her features. "Emily, I've changed. I want to be there for you. We can start fresh. You just have to give me a chance." "Mom," Emily faltered, her heart aching at the thought of hurting either of them. "I want to spend time with you, but I don't want to leave Grandma." Margaret's hand found Emily's, squeezing it reassuringly. "You don't have to decide anything today. Let's just talk. Okay? We can work through this together." As the tension hung in the room, Emily felt the weight of the world pressing down upon her small shoulders. She wanted nothing more than to bridge the gap between her mother and grandmother, to heal the fractures of their family. Yet, as she looked at the two women she loved most, she realized that the road ahead would be anything but easy. The following day, the courthouse loomed ahead like a fortress, its heavy doors a gateway to the unknown. Emily felt a knot of anxiety twist in her stomach as she walked beside Margaret. The atmosphere was charged, filled with whispers and the shuffling of papers. Familiar faces filled the benches. Friends, neighbors, and strangers alike, all drawn to witness the unfolding drama. As they took their seats, Margaret whispered words of reassurance. "Just remember, my darling, we're in this together. You're strong, and you have a voice." Emily nodded, her heart racing as she took in the imposing figure of Judge Collins, a stern woman with a commanding presence. The gavel struck, echoing through the room, and the proceedings began. Both sides presented their arguments, Margaret painting a picture of a stable home filled with love, while Sarah's lawyer spoke of redemption and second chances. As the words flowed, Emily's mind raced, her thoughts a chaotic whirlpool of emotions. She felt small and vulnerable, caught in a tempest of loyalty and love. As Margaret spoke, her voice steady and filled with conviction, Emily found herself clinging to her grandmother's words, letting them wrap around her like a protective shield. She looked toward her mother, whose expression was a mixture of hope and desperation. In that moment, Emily understood that the battle for her heart had only just begun. The courtroom felt heavy with tension as Emily stepped onto the witness stand, her small frame dwarfed by the towering chair. She clenched her hands together, taking a deep breath to steady her racing heart. The bright lights above felt uncomfortably hot, and she could feel the eyes of the entire courtroom trained on her, judging, scrutinizing. Her grandmother, Margaret, sat to the side, her expression a mixture of pride and concern. "Emily," Judge Collins said gently, her voice cutting through the silence, "can you please state your full name for the record?" "Emily Rose Thompson," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. She looked down at her lap, fiddling with the hem of her dress, trying to gather her thoughts. "Do you know why you are here today?" the judge continued, leaning forward slightly. Emily nodded, her courage slowly building. "Yes, Your Honor. I'm here because my mother wants to take me away from my grandma." She paused, searching for the right words, feeling the weight of everyone's expectations. "But I don't want to go." A murmur rippled through the courtroom, and Emily could see her mother, Sarah, shift uncomfortably in her seat. She caught a glimpse of Sarah's face, a mix of anger and desperation, and it made her stomach churn. "Can you tell us a little about your life with your grandmother?" Judge Collins prompted, her expression softening. Emily took a deep breath, her mind racing back to the countless moments she cherished with Margaret. "My grandma. She's always there for me. We play chess together, and she tells me stories about when she was a little girl." A smile spread across her face, momentarily easing the tension in the room. "She makes the best chocolate chip cookies, and we have movie nights every Friday. I feel safe with her." Margaret's eyes glistened with tears, and Emily could see her grandmother's lips quivering, a mixture of joy and sorrow. The judge nodded, clearly moved by Emily's words. "And how do you feel about your mother?" Judge Collins continued, her tone carefully probing. Emily hesitated, the memories of her mother flooding her mind. I don't know," she admitted. "I remember some good times, But, she paused, weighing her next words carefully. Everything changed after Dad died. Mom wasn't the same. She started going out a lot and would leave me alone. The courtroom was silent as her words hung in the air. Emily could sense the tension rising again, especially from Sarah, who was now leaning forward, her expression a mixture of fury and fear. "Do you feel safe with your mother?" the judge asked, her voice steady but kind. Emily shook her head, her voice trembling slightly. "No, I don't feel safe when she's around. I worry about her." Her heart raced as she spoke, the truth spilling out of her. "Sometimes I hear her crying at night, and she doesn't always come home when she says she will." The judge's expression hardened slightly as murmurs of disbelief echoed through the courtroom. Emily glanced at her mother, catching a glimpse of the hurt and anger etched across her face. But she had to be honest. "Emily, thank you for sharing that with us," Judge Collins said, her voice gentle yet firm. "You've shown a lot of bravery today." As Emily stepped down from the witness stand, she felt the weight of her words settle around her like a heavy blanket. She made her way back to Margaret, who enveloped her in a warm embrace, whispering words of encouragement and love. "You did so well, my darling. You were so brave," Margaret said, her voice trembling with emotion. But the moment of comfort was cut short when the court broke for a recess. Emily watched as people began to stand and talk amongst themselves, the tension in the room palpable. She needed fresh air, a moment to breathe away from the weight of so many eyes. As she stepped outside the courtroom, she noticed her mother and Sarah's lawyer huddled together in a corner, their voices low and conspiratorial. Intrigued, Emily crept closer, trying to remain unnoticed. "I don't care how it looks," Sarah's lawyer was saying, his voice sharp. "We need to get that inheritance. It's the only way we can ensure you have the support you need. You can't let her have it all." Emily's heart raced as she tried to process what she was hearing. Inheritance? What did that have to do with anything? Her father had left some money, but she had always thought it was for her future, for school, and for the things she loved. But now it sounded like there was a hidden agenda, something her mother was trying to keep from her. "What if she tells the judge?" Sarah asked, her voice laced with panic. "She won't," the lawyer replied confidently. "Just keep playing the part of the concerned mother. We need to make her believe that you're serious about wanting her back. Once we have that money, we can figure out the rest." A chill ran down Emily's spine. Her mother wasn't just fighting for her. She was fighting for something else entirely. Money. The realization made her stomach twist in knots. Did Sarah really want her back? Or was it all about the inheritance? Just then, Margaret appeared behind her, her eyes scanning the crowd before landing on Emily's worried face. "Dear, what are you doing out here?" she asked, concern etched on her features. I overheard Mom and her lawyer," Emily said, her voice trembling. "They were talking about inheritance." Margaret's face paled slightly as she crouched down to meet Emily's eyes. "What did they say?" she asked urgently. Emily recounted the conversation, each word feeling heavier than the last. Margaret listened intently, her expression shifting from concern to determination. "Oh, Emily," she said softly, her hands gently gripping the girl's shoulders. "You are so brave for telling me this. I promise, we will figure this out together." As they returned to the courtroom, the atmosphere was charged with anxiety. Emily could feel the weight of her secret pressing down on her, and the thought of facing her mother again filled her with dread. But she also felt a flicker of resolve. She had to be honest not just for herself, but for the love she felt for her grandmother. Back inside the courtroom, Emily took her seat next to Margaret, her heart still racing. The judge entered, and the room fell silent once more. She looked around, her gaze landing on Emily, who felt a surge of warmth from her grandmother's steady presence beside her. "Let's continue," Judge Collins announced, her voice commanding but fair. "We will now hear further testimony regarding the custody of Emily Thompson." As the proceedings continued, Emily felt a sense of purpose rising within her. She knew that the truth was her ally, and no matter how difficult it became, she was ready to stand by her grandmother. The battle was far from over, but she was determined to fight for the love that had always been there, waiting for her. The courtroom buzzed with tension as Margaret stood, poised to unveil the troubling aspects of Sarah's past. Her heart raced, but she knew that the truth was her strongest ally. As she adjusted her glasses, she focused her gaze on Judge Collins, who sat behind the bench, her expression one of keen interest mixed with a hint of skepticism. The air was thick with anticipation as Margaret began to speak. "Your Honor," Margaret started, her voice steady despite the weight of the moment. "I believe it is imperative that the court understands the full history of Sarah's behavior, particularly concerning her ability to provide a safe environment for Emily." She paused to take a breath, her heart aching for the granddaughter she fought so hard to protect. "Sarah has a documented history of instability," Margaret continued, her voice now firmer. "When Emily was a toddler, Sarah struggled with severe emotional distress, which manifested in neglect. There were instances when she left Emily unsupervised for hours, and on one occasion, she was found asleep in a parked car after a night of drinking." Gasps echoed through the courtroom. Emily sat in the witness stand, her small fingers interlaced tightly. She felt the weight of her grandmother's words, a mixture of fear and relief washing over her. She had always known that Sarah had her struggles, but hearing it laid bare was unsettling. "Your Honor," Margaret pressed on, "I have documentation from social services and even a police report from that time. I can provide those records if necessary." Judge Collins nodded, her brow furrowed in contemplation. "We may need to see those documents, Ms. Williams," she stated, her tone grave. "This information is critical to determining custody." As the courtroom murmured, Sarah's expression shifted from disbelief to anger. "This is absurd," she shouted, her voice breaking through the tension like glass shattering. "Those events happened years ago. I've changed. I'm a different person now." Margaret stood her ground, unwavering. "People can change, but past actions often speak louder than promises. Sarah, Emily's safety is what matters here." The judge raised her hand, calling for silence. "Ms. Green, I advise you to remain calm. This is a court of law, not a venue for emotional outbursts." Emily's heart raced as she listened to the exchange. The thought of losing her grandmother felt like a weight pulling her down into a dark abyss. After a moment of silence, she turned to Margaret, her voice a mere whisper. "What if they don't believe you?" Margaret leaned in closer, her eyes filled with warmth and reassurance. "Emily, love and truth will always prevail. You have to trust in that." The recess that followed was filled with whispers and anxious glances. Emily felt trapped in her own thoughts, her mind racing with worries. Would the judge see her grandmother's love as more significant than Sarah's past mistakes? Could she truly lose the only home she had ever known? As the court reconvened, the tension was palpable. Sarah's lawyer, a slick man with an air of arrogance, rose to respond. "Your Honor, while my client acknowledges her past, she has worked hard to rebuild her life. She deserves a chance to prove herself as a mother. This is not merely about past mistakes. It's about the future." "Is it truly about the future?" Margaret interjected, her voice steady. "Or is it about reaping the benefits of Emily's inheritance?" That statement hung in the air like a storm cloud. Sarah's face blanched, and for a brief moment, Emily saw fear flicker in her mother's eyes. The implications of those words were heavy, and she felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She recalled the whispered conversation she had overheard during the recess, her heart pounding as she pieced together the motivations behind her mother's presence in her life. "Your Honor," Sarah's lawyer said, attempting to regain control of the narrative, "my client only wishes to reconnect with her daughter. We have evidence of her efforts to improve her situation." Margaret's voice rang out again, cutting through the tension. "And what about Emily's emotional well-being? What about her memories of neglect? You can't simply erase the past, and you can't erase the truth." The judge sat back, her fingers steepled, deep in thought. "I will not allow this courtroom to turn into a battleground for personal grievances. I expect decorum from both sides." Emily watched as the judge's gavel echoed, calling for order. For a moment, she felt a flicker of hope. If only she could find the courage to speak, to tell the truth that weighed heavy on her young heart. After a brief recess, the court was called back to order, and Emily's school counselor, Mrs. Thompson, was summoned to the stand. Emily's heart raced as she recognized the woman who had always been kind to her at school. She remembered the way Mrs. Thompson had listened to her worries, never dismissing her feelings. "Mrs. Thompson," the lawyer for Margaret began, "can you please tell the court about your observations regarding Emily's emotional state while living with her grandmother?" "Absolutely," Mrs. Thompson replied, her voice calm and reassuring. "I've known Emily for several years now. Throughout her time with Margaret, I have seen her flourish. She is happy, well-adjusted, and has shown remarkable resilience despite the circumstances surrounding her father's passing." Emily felt a warmth spread through her chest, knowing that Mrs. Thompson understood her. "Can you describe any changes you have observed in Emily's demeanor when she is with her mother?" the lawyer pressed. Mrs. Thompson hesitated, her brow furrowed in thought. "When Emily has had contact with Sarah, I've noticed increased anxiety. She becomes withdrawn and often expresses fears about her mother's stability. It's clear that living with Margaret provides her a sense of safety and security that is vital for her emotional development." Sarah's face twisted in anger as she listened, her lips pursed tightly. "That's a lie!" she shouted, her voice echoing through the courtroom. "Emily is just being manipulated." Judge Collins banged her gavel once more, her patience wearing thin. "Order. This is not a place for accusations. We are here to determine what is best for Emily, not to engage in personal attacks." As the testimony continued, Emily felt a strange sense of empowerment. Each word Mrs. Thompson spoke reinforced the bond she shared with her grandmother. It was not just about a legal battle. It was about love, safety, and the home that had nurtured her through the darkest times. When Mrs. Thompson finally stepped down, Judge Collins turned to Margaret. "Ms. Williams, do you have any closing statements?" Margaret stood taller, her voice steady. "Your Honor, I have dedicated my life to ensuring Emily has a loving and stable environment. This is not merely a custody battle. This is about her future. I will always prioritize her well-being above all else. I ask the court to consider not just the past, but the present and the future we can build together." Emily's heart swelled with pride for her grandmother, the woman who had fought for her every step of the way. She glanced at Sarah, who sat with her arms crossed, a mask of defiance plastered on her face. In that moment, as the courtroom quieted and the weight of the proceedings hung heavy in the air, Emily realized that no matter the outcome, she was not alone. She had Margaret, a steadfast guardian who had shown her the true meaning of family. And in a world where love and truth intertwined, she clung to the hope that those qualities would guide them through whatever came next. The courtroom was tense, a thick silence enveloping the space as Sarah stood at the front, her face flushed with anger. The air was electric, charged with emotions swirling around like a storm about to break. Margaret sat composed, her hands folded tightly in her lap, but even she could feel the tremors of anxiety rippling through her. Judge Collins, with her sharp gaze, was ready to restore order, but Sarah seemed to have reached her limit. "I can't just sit here and watch you destroy my life, Margaret," Sarah shouted, her voice echoing off the courtroom walls. "You think you're the perfect grandmother? You're just a bitter old woman trying to keep my daughter away from me." The accusation dripped with venom, and Emily, who had been sitting quietly on the witness stand, felt her heart race. She had never seen her mother so unhinged. "Miss Sarah, I advise you to calm down," Judge Collins said sharply, her voice firm but measured. "This is a place of order, not chaos. You will conduct yourself appropriately, or I will have no choice but to have you removed." But Sarah was far beyond reason. "You think that by playing the doting grandmother you can win this case? Emily deserves a mother, not a jailer." Her words hung in the air, heavy and accusatory, and Emily felt a pang of fear at the chaos that had erupted. "Enough!" Judge Collins banged her gavel, the sound resonating like a warning. "I will not tolerate this behavior. If you cannot maintain your composure, I will have you escorted out. Sarah's eyes flickered with desperation, and for a moment, Margaret saw a glint of vulnerability behind the rage. You don't understand, Judge. I've made mistakes, but I'm trying to change. I love Emily. I want her back. Margaret took a deep breath, her heart aching for her granddaughter, who was now caught in the crossfire. She turned to Emily, whose wide eyes reflected confusion and fear. You know the truth, Emily? She whispered, her voice barely audible. Don't let her words sway you. Emily nodded, but her mind raced with contradictions. She loved Margaret fiercely, but a part of her still yearned for the mother she barely knew, the mother who had been absent for so long. The courtroom buzzed around her, but she felt isolated, trapped in a whirlwind of emotions. Meanwhile, in the hallway outside the courtroom, Emily's best friend Lucy paced nervously. She had been waiting for Emily to return from the stand, and she couldn't shake the feeling that her friend was carrying a burden far heavier than anyone realized. When Emily finally emerged, her face was pale, her eyes clouded with worry. What happened in there? Lucy asked, concern etched on her face. You look like you've seen a ghost. Emily took a deep breath, her hands shaking slightly. It's just my mom. She's not okay, Luce. She's angry and scared, and I don't know what to do. Lucy stepped closer, her voice gentle yet firm. You have to be brave, Emily. If you know anything important, you need to tell them. Could change everything. Emily swallowed hard, the weight of Lucy's words pressing down on her. She had kept secrets, things that twisted in her stomach like knots. But what if it makes things worse? She whispered, her voice barely above a whisper. It won't. You have to think about what's best for you. You love your grandma, and she loves you. You deserve to be safe and happy, Em. Lucy's emerald eyes sparkled with determination, anchoring Emily in that moment. Okay, Emily finally said, her voice steadier than before. I'll try. I just wish it wasn't so complicated. Back in the courtroom, tensions were still high. As Sarah's lawyer stood up to present his witness, the atmosphere shifted again. He called forth a character witness, a man named Richard, who claimed to have known Margaret for years. Emily felt a wave of anxiety wash over her as Richard approached the stand, his demeanor calm but insidious. Mr. Richard, the lawyer began, can you describe your relationship with Ms. Margaret? Richard cleared his throat, adjusting his glasses. Yes, I've known Margaret for most of my life. She's a kind woman, but I've also seen her fail to provide a stable environment for Emily. There have been incidents. Emily's stomach dropped. Incidents? She murmured under her breath, her heart racing. She felt a cold sweat break out on her forehead. Yes, Richard continued, his voice steady. I believe Emily is better off in a home that can provide more structure. Margaret's face paled, but she quickly regained her composure. What incidents are you referring to, Richard? She asked, her voice steady yet laced with an edge. The man hesitated, as if weighing his words carefully. There have been rumors in town about Margaret's ability to care for Emily, particularly after the accident. The judge interjected, her brow furrowing. What rumors? This is a court of law. We deal with facts, not hearsay. Richard shifted, looking uncomfortable. Just things people say. I can't recall specifics, but it's been mentioned that Emily might not be in the best hands. Margaret's eyes narrowed. And what do you know about my home? Have you ever visited? Have you seen how I care for Emily? I've heard things, Richard said defensively. People talk. Rumors. Margaret spat, her patience wearing thin. What kind of witness are you if you can't bring any facts to the table? Order. Judge Collins commanded, her gavel striking the desk again. This is not a circus. I will not tolerate baseless accusations. Mr. Richard, do you have any credible evidence to support your claims? Richard faltered, looking sheepish. I know, I just thought. Exactly. Judge Collins interrupted. You are dismissed. As Richard stepped down, Emily felt a rush of relief, but it was short-lived. She could see Sarah's face, twisted with anger and desperation. The courtroom felt heavy with unresolved tension, and Emily's heart raced as she realized just how much was at stake. Margaret caught Emily's eye and gave her a reassuring nod, a silent promise that they would get through this together. But the uncertainty hung in the air, a dark cloud that refused to dissipate. As the day wore on, the trial continued to unfold, each witness adding layers of complexity to the case. Emily could see the weariness etched on Margaret's face, and it made her heart ache. She wanted nothing more than for this nightmare to end, but she knew that the only way out was to face the truth, no matter how painful it might be. "Emily," the judge called, her voice cutting through the tension. "You're still on the stand. Do you have anything else to share?" Everyone turned to Emily, their eyes searching her face for answers. She felt the weight of their gazes, the intensity of the moment pressing down on her. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words eluded her. "Ms. Emily, if you have something to say, now is the time," Judge Collins prompted gently, her tone encouraging yet firm. Taking a deep breath, Emily remembered Lucy's words. She thought of her grandmother, the love they shared, and the secrets that had been buried deep within her heart. I need to talk about my dad," she finally said, her voice trembling yet resolute. The courtroom fell silent as all eyes were on her, and she could feel the gravity of the moment. She was ready to reveal the truth, to finally lift the weight that had been pressing on her chest. But as she looked at her mother, she felt a pang of fear. Would this really help? Would it make things worse? But deep down, she knew she had to be brave. The final day of the hearing dawned with a thick air of tension swirling through the courthouse. Emily sat in the waiting area, her heart pounding as she fidgeted with the hem of her favorite pink sweater. It had been her father's last gift to her before the accident, and she wore it like armor, reminding herself of the love that still surrounded her despite the storm brewing in the courtroom. Off to the side, Margaret, her grandmother, was seated, her expression a mix of determination and concern. "Emily, sweetheart," Margaret said softly, leaning closer, her voice steady. "Remember that you are strong, no matter what happens. We are in this together." Emily nodded, though her stomach churned with anxiety. "What if they don't believe me, Grandma?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, betraying her fear. "They will believe you, my dear. You are speaking your truth, and that is powerful," Margaret reassured her, squeezing her hand gently. As the clock ticked closer to the time when Emily would take the stand again, she felt the weight of the world on her small shoulders. She had spent the night writing in her diary, pouring out her heart, but the thought of reading her words aloud in front of everyone, especially her mother, filled her with dread. When the courtroom doors swung open, Emily's breath hitched in her throat. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation, and the spectators, friends, family, and strangers, sat in a hushed silence that felt both supportive and suffocating. She could see Sarah's lawyer, a sharp-dressed man with slicked-back hair, whispering something to Sarah, whose face was drawn tight with anxiety. "Emily, it's time," the bailiff announced, gesturing for her to enter. Taking a deep breath, Emily stepped into the courtroom, her heart racing. She walked past the rows of people, her eyes finding Margaret's for reassurance. The warmth in her grandmother's gaze helped steady her nerves, and she took her seat in the witness stand, gripping the edges to keep her hands from shaking. Judge Collins sat at the front, her eyes softening as they met Emily's. "You're doing wonderfully, Emily. We're all here to listen to you," she said, encouragingly. Emily cleared her throat. "Thank you, Your Honor." The judge nodded, motioning for her to begin. Emily felt the weight of the moment settle over her like a heavy blanket. She glanced briefly at Sarah, whose expression was unreadable, before focusing on her diary resting on the stand before her. With a deep breath, she opened the diary, its pages filled with her thoughts, fears, and dreams. "I've been keeping a diary," she began, her voice gaining strength. "I wanted to remember everything because it helps me understand what's happening." A murmur rippled through the courtroom, and Emily paused, feeling the eyes of everyone on her, weighing her words. She flipped through the pages, feeling a mix of pride and vulnerability as she prepared to share her innermost feelings. "I want to read you something," she said, her heart racing as she scanned the pages. "This is from the day my dad died." She took a deep breath and began to read aloud, her voice steady but laced with emotion. "Dear Diary," she read. "Today was a bad day. Mom was acting strange again. She was loud and didn't even notice that I was home. I wanted to tell her about my day, but she didn't listen. I was scared. But later, Grandma came over and we played chess. I love playing with her because she always makes me feel safe." A hush fell over the room, the weight of her words sinking in. Emily continued, her voice growing stronger as she shared more entries. "Sometimes I wish things were different. I love my mom, but she gets angry a lot, and it makes me feel small. I don't want to be scared anymore." Tears streamed down Sarah's cheeks, and Emily caught a glimpse of pain in her mother's eyes. But she pressed on, reading more entries that described her daily life, her fears of losing Margaret, and her longing for a stable, loving home. "I can't remember the last time Mom hugged me," she confessed, her voice trembling. "But Grandma always hugs me, and it feels like home." The emotional weight of her words resonated through the courtroom. Emily looked up, her gaze landing on Judge Collins, who was listening intently, her expression somber. "Thank you for sharing that, Emily," the judge said gently after Emily finished reading. "Your words are very powerful." Emily felt a rush of relief, but her heart raced as she prepared to read the last entry she had penned just the night before. "This is the last thing I wrote," she said, her voice quieter now. "I wrote it because I don't want anyone to forget what happened. I need to be brave." She flipped to the last page, her hands trembling as she searched for the words she had written in a moment of clarity. "Dear Diary," she began. "I'm scared. I feel like I'm in the middle of a storm. I just want to stay with Grandma because she loves me, and I feel safe with her. I wish Mom could be different, but I don't want to go back to being scared." As she finished reading, the room was silent. Emily could feel the gravity of her words hang in the air, and a sense of finality washed over her. For the first time, she felt a sense of freedom in sharing her truth. Sarah wiped her tears, her voice shaky. "Emily, But Judge Collins raised a hand, silencing Sarah. "This is not the time for responses," she said firmly. "Emily has shared her truth, and it's important we respect that." The judge turned to Emily, her eyes softening again. "Thank you, Emily, for your bravery. I know this is difficult, but you've shown great strength today." Emily nodded, her heart still racing but filled with a newfound sense of purpose. She had done what she set out to do. She had spoken her truth, and now it was in the hands of the court to decide her future. As she stepped down from the stand, she felt Margaret's proud gaze upon her, and for the first time since the case began, Emily felt a glimmer of hope. She had shared her heart, and no matter the outcome, she knew she had fought for her right to be heard. In that moment, Emily realized that love wasn't just about being together. It was about being understood, accepted, and cherished for who you truly are. And as she walked back to her grandmother's side, she understood the power of her voice, a power that would echo long after the courtroom doors closed behind her. The courtroom was heavy with anticipation, the air thick with unspoken words and emotions as Judge Collins adjusted her glasses and prepared to address the room. Emily sat on the witness stand, her small frame contrasting sharply with the imposing atmosphere surrounding her. The judge's stern face softened slightly as she regarded the girl, who had just bared her soul to the court through her diary entries. But before the judge could speak, Emily shifted nervously, her gaze flickering between her grandmother, Margaret, who sat in the front row, and her mother, Sarah, whose expression was a mask of tension and denial. "Your Honor," Emily began hesitantly, her voice barely above a whisper. "There's something else I wrote about. Something I saw." The room went silent. All eyes were on her, including those of Sarah, whose demeanor shifted from defensive to alarmed. Margaret leaned forward, concern etched on her face, sensing the gravity of what was about to unfold. "What do you mean, Emily?" the judge inquired gently, her tone inviting yet firm. Taking a deep breath, Emily opened her diary once again. her fingers trembling slightly as she turned the pages. "I wrote about the night my dad." She paused, swallowing hard. "The night he died. I saw my mom before it happened." A murmur rippled through the courtroom, and Judge Collins raised an eyebrow, urging her to continue. "Please go on." Emily's heart raced as she recalled that fateful evening, the memory sharp and painful. "I remembered that Mom had been drinking. She was yelling and she left me alone. She said she was going to a party, but I think she just wanted to forget." Her voice quavered, but she pressed on, determined to share the truth. "I was scared. I waited for her to come back, but she didn't." Sarah's face paled, and she looked as though she had been struck. "Emily, that's not—" she started, but the judge raised her hand, silencing her. "Emily," Judge Collins interrupted, her voice steady yet kind. "What happened next?" "I heard the crash," Emily continued, tears welling in her eyes. "I thought it was a dream, but it wasn't. I ran outside and saw the car. Mom's car. It was wrecked." The courtroom felt like it was holding its breath. "I saw Dad, and I knew he was gone. He never came home." The weight of Emily's words hung heavily in the air, and the gravity of the situation began to dawn on everyone present. The room was still, as if time itself had paused to absorb the reality of what Emily had just revealed. "Your Honor," Sarah's lawyer interjected, attempting to regain control of the situation. "This is hearsay and we cannot allow—" "Objection noted," Judge Collins said, her voice firm. "However, Emily's testimony is relevant to the case at hand. We need to understand the circumstances surrounding that night." She turned back to Emily, her expression softening. "You are very brave for sharing this, Emily. Thank you." As Emily nodded, wiping her tears, she felt a sense of relief wash over her. The truth was out, and she hoped it would help everyone understand. But the atmosphere in the courtroom had shifted dramatically. Sarah's composure was unraveling, her hands trembling at her sides as she struggled to maintain her facade. "Emily, I was just trying to have fun that night," Sarah exclaimed, desperation creeping into her voice. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen. You have to believe me." Emily shook her head, her resolve strengthening. "You left me alone, Mom. You chose to go out instead of being with me. You didn't care about what could happen." A wave of murmurs erupted in the courtroom, and Judge Collins pounded her gavel. "Silence," she commanded, her voice echoing through the chamber. "This is a court of law, and we will not tolerate outbursts." The judge took a moment to gather her thoughts, her gaze shifting between Margaret and Sarah. "I will allow this testimony to stand as a crucial piece of evidence in this custody case. Emily, your bravery in speaking the truth is commendable." Emily felt a surge of hope. Maybe this would be enough to keep her with Margaret, the only person who had always been there for her. After the courtroom settled, the judge turned her attention back to the proceedings. "I have heard enough to reach a decision. The court must prioritize the safety and well-being of Emily. Based on the testimony presented today, it is clear that there are serious concerns regarding Sarah's ability to provide a stable environment." Sarah's face crumbled, her eyes wide with disbelief. "No, this can't be happening. I am her mother. I can change. I will change." Her pleas echoed through the room, but the judge remained unmoved. "While I understand the emotional weight of this situation," Judge Collins continued, "it is my duty to ensure that Emily is placed in the best possible environment for her growth and happiness." Sarah's lawyer stood up, trying to salvage the situation. "Your Honor, we would like to request a psychological evaluation for Sarah. She has faced significant hardships, and we believe that with assistance, she can be a fit mother." Judge Collins considered this for a moment, then nodded. "A psychological evaluation will be mandated, along with rehabilitation programs for substance use. However, I cannot ignore the evidence presented here today. The court is awarding full custody of Emily to her grandmother, Margaret." The courtroom erupted into a mix of reactions. Gasps of shock, murmurs of relief, and cries of disbelief. Emily's heart soared with joy, and she felt her grandmother's warm embrace enveloping her as Margaret rushed to her side. "Thank you, thank you, thank you," Emily cried, tears streaming down her cheeks. "You believed me." Margaret held her tightly, her own tears of relief mingling with Emily's. "Of course, my dear. I will always believe you. You were so brave." Across the room, Sarah stood frozen, her face pale and stricken. "Emily, please, I can change. I'm your mother," she shouted, her voice cracking. But the courtroom had already made its decision, and the walls of support that had once surrounded her were now crumbling. As Emily looked into her mother's eyes, she felt a mixture of sadness and pity. "I hope you do change, Mom, but I can't live like that anymore. I need to be safe and happy." With that, Emily turned her back on Sarah, the weight of the moment settling into her heart. She had spoken the truth, and it had set her free. In the embrace of her grandmother, she found solace and security, knowing that they would navigate this new beginning together. As they walked out of the courtroom hand in hand, a new chapter awaited them, one filled with love, understanding, and the courage to face whatever came next. Emily had found her voice in the midst of chaos, and she was ready to embrace the life that lay ahead, with Margaret by her side, a family bound by love and resilience.